Nobody at the Dwight D. Eisenhower Veterans Medical Center wanted to fight for the man in room 309. Welcome back to Quiet Badge's Stories. I'm glad you're here. If this story moves you, please hit the like button, subscribe, and drop a comment letting me know where in the world you're listening from. These stories travel farther than I expect, and every location you share reminds me why they matter. Now let's begin. The doctors called Sergeant Major Felix Drummond unresponsive. The rehabilitation team called him a low-priority placement. The charge nurse on the morning shift called him difficult, which was the word she used for patients who stared too long and made people feel judged without saying anything at all. Felix had not said anything in 7 months. A roadside bomb in eastern Syria had seen to that. Traumatic brain injury, severe, expressive aphasia, no motor speech function, no meaningful interaction with environment. That was what the intake assessment said. The assessment had been written by Dr. Howard Breck, and Dr. Howard Breck had decided very early what Felix Drummond was and what Felix Drummond would remain. Only one nurse in the wing questioned any of it. Her name was Teresa Vang, and she wore bright blue scrubs that were always a half size too large, her dark hair pinned back in the kind of knot that had been redone 6 times before shift change and still looked like it might give up. She was 41 years old. She had been at Eisenhower VA for 2 years. She spoke quietly, moved efficiently, and had a habit of stopping at doorways before entering. Not from hesitation, but from the kind of situational awareness that becomes muscle memory in people who have spent time in places where a doorway could mean anything. She stopped at room 309 on a Tuesday in November, before morning rounds, because she heard a sound that should not have been there. Tapping. Not the tap of machinery, not a loose IV line against a rail. A pause. 2 more. Teresa stood very still in the hallway. 3-2, 3-2. She had not heard that pattern in 6 years. She walked in. Felix Drummond lay in the adjustable bed with his eyes fixed on the ceiling. He was 44 years old and built like someone who had spent 2 decades carrying weight that was not always gear. The left side of his face carried a faint tremor the staff had documented as residual motor dysfunction. His right hand rested beside his hip. His right index finger was tapping against the mattress. 3 taps, pause, 2 taps. Teresa pulled a chair to the bedside. She sat. She waited for 1 breath, then pressed 2 fingers lightly against the back of his hand. She tapped once, twice, a pause, then once again. The tapping under her fingers stopped. Felix Drummond's eyes moved from the ceiling to her face. They were dark brown and completely clear, not clouded, not absent, sharp in the way eyes get when a person has been screaming from inside a room with no door and someone has finally knocked. Teresa kept her face neutral, the way she had been trained to keep it, when everything inside her was doing something else entirely. He tapped again, slower this time, deliberate, the same pattern. She answered the same way she always had 6 years ago, in the dark, in the dust, with a radio cutting out and friendlies on the wrong side of a ridgeline. 3-2 meant, I see you, still here. Her response meant, received. Dr. Howard Breck arrived at 7:40 for morning rounds with 2 residents and a clipboard he held like a shield. He was 53, silver at the temples, and accustomed to being the most certain person in any room. He had built his career on certainty. Certainty got grants, certainty got speaking invitations. Certainty got him the principal investigator slot on the Cortex Meridian trial, which was running out of suitable candidates and running into deadline pressure from its private funding source, a neurotech company called Nova Veil Systems. Breck stopped at room 309 and reviewed the chart without looking at the patient. Still no purposeful movement, he said. Continue passive range of motion. Family counsel for long-term placement. Teresa was at the medication cart 6 feet away. His right index finger demonstrates a consistent tapping pattern, repeating interval, possible intentional communication. Breck looked at her over his clipboard. Miss Vang. It's been documented in my notes for 3 days. Your notes describe tapping. He said the word the way a person might say coincidence, with the patience of someone explaining gravity to a child. Rhythmic motor activity in TBI patients is a known non-purposeful phenomenon. This is not rhythmic in the way you mean. The intervals are irregular, the pattern repeats. One of the residents, a young man named Pauling, shifted his weight. Breck set the clipboard down. Nurse Vang, how long have you been on this unit? 2 years. And prior to Eisenhower. Teresa met his eyes, Air Force Medical. Then you understand, Breck said, slowly, that a medical technician's intuition about a complex TBI presentation is not a diagnostic tool. The other resident studied the floor. Teresa said, I understand that documented observations should be reviewed before they're dismissed. I reviewed them. He picked up the clipboard. Continue current care plan. He left. The residents followed. Teresa stood beside the cart for a moment, then turned back to room 309. Felix's eyes were on the doorway where Breck had stood, not blank, furious. She recognized the look. She had worn it herself, in rooms where men made decisions about situations they had never been in. The first crisis came 3 days later. Teresa was in the medication room when Pauling found her. His voice was too fast, blood pressure dropping. Room 309, no identifiable trigger. She was there in 40 seconds. Felix's pressure was 82/46 and falling. His pulse was in the low 40s. His skin had gone the color of old ash. The positioning device behind his head had shifted, pulling his neck into extension. Not dramatically, not visibly wrong to someone who was not looking for it, but enough. Teresa adjusted the device with both hands before she said anything else. Neutral alignment, no extension. His pressure steadied at 87. He has a cervical component, she said to the floor nurse. Positioning triggers autonomic dysreflexia. His vitals have been showing this for 11 days. It is in my notes. She said it without anger. There was no time for anger. Breck arrived 4 minutes later. He looked at the monitor, which now read 91/58, then looked at Teresa. What happened? Autonomic dysreflexia secondary to cervical positioning. His headrest was extended. The vitals are improving. Because I repositioned him. Breck's jaw tightened. You should have paged before intervening. His heart rate was 41. That is not the protocol. He would have coded before the page was answered. The room went quiet. A respiratory tech by the window stopped writing. Breck turned to the staff. Document vagal response repositioned, stable. He looked at Teresa. A note will be placed in your file regarding unilateral intervention. Put it there, she said. After he left, Pauling came to stand beside her. He kept his voice low. You could file a safety concern. I am. Teresa did not look up from the chart. I have been. She walked back into room 309 and sat beside the bed. Felix's eyes found her immediately. She pressed 2 fingers to the back of his hand. Received. He tapped back. This time it was different. Slower. Letters, not the field code. She had to watch his finger more carefully. SABLE. Teresa went very still. Sable. That was not Felix Drummond's call sign, that was hers. The name she had buried with her discharge papers and a dead man's boots and 6 years of deliberate forgetting. She bent close to his hand. You know who I am, not a question. He tapped once. Yes. She exhaled slowly. How? He tried to tap again. The effort was visible. Sweat at his temple, jaw tightening, concentration that cost him something to spend. HAWN. Her chest went hollow. Jesse Hahn, 26 years old, corporal, combat medic. The kind of grinning, relentless person who could crack a joke while applying a tourniquet and mean both things completely. He had been attached to Felix's Ranger Battalion for the Kandahar rotation. He had died in a medevac bay with Teresa's hands on his chest and another casualty screaming for her through the partition. She had believed she left Jesse Hahn alone at the end. She had not known Felix Drummond was there too. He told you about me, she whispered. 1 tap. The silence after it was very large. She was still sitting with it when Breck's shadow crossed the doorway. Miss Vang, he said. You're being reassigned from this patient's care. She stood. On what basis? Excessive emotional involvement and continued insubordination. He held the door, effective this shift. Felix's right hand pressed against the mattress. Teresa looked at it. She looked at Breck. He has active communication capability you have categorized as reflexive motor activity. If I am reassigned, there is no one on this unit who can interpret what he is trying to say. He is not trying to say anything. That is the documented clinical finding. Your documented clinical finding. Breck's voice dropped. You have been here 2 years, and in that time you have challenged 3 care plans and 2 transfer decisions. I have been generous in not escalating this before now. You have been hoping I would stop, Teresa said. I am not going to. His expression shifted into something colder. Then I will make it formal. He left to make it formal. At 2:17 that afternoon, Felix Drummond went into the second crisis. His oxygen saturation dropped to 88. His blood pressure followed. An alarm brought the floor nurse first, then Pauling, then Teresa from the hallway, where she had been standing because she could not make herself leave. She pushed through without a word. She checked his position, headrest again, shifted during a linen change. She corrected it. She called for oxygen. You are not assigned to this patient, the floor nurse said. Get respiratory, right now. The floor nurse hesitated. His oxygen is 84, move. They moved. She kept her hands at his head through the resuscitation. She talked to him in the low, clear voice she had used in aircraft, in field stations, in places where the only thing between a person and the dark was another person who refused to go quiet. I hear you. I know you're in there. Stay with me, Ridgeback. Ridgeback. His call sign. When she first walked to room 309, he had confirmed it 2 days ago, tapping slowly through her palm. Ridgeback. His oxygen climbed, 8794. Breck arrived at 2:31. He took in the room and looked at Teresa with an expression that had moved past frustration into something more deliberate. I told you. Autonomic crisis secondary to positioning, 2nd episode in 6 days. He needs cervical imaging and a formal autonomic protocol. I will determine what he needs. Then determine it before he codes. Pauling spoke from the doorway. Sir, the pattern she's describing is consistent with high cervical involvement. The positioning correlation is documented across 4 separate incidents. Breck turned to him. Pauling did not back down. He was 28 years old and had just decided something about himself. It's in the notes, all 4 incidents. The monitor climbed to 98. Felix's face had recovered some color. His eyes were on Teresa with the focused attention of a man on a ridgeline, tracking something everyone else had decided was not there. Breck ordered the imaging to end the argument. Teresa understood that. He expected it to say nothing. She expected it to say everything. She was right. The MRI showed a subdural collection at C3-C4. Small, persistent, positioned precisely where it would cause intermittent compression without presenting as a dramatic lesion on a standard survey scan. The kind of finding that required someone to look for it. The kind of finding that explained 7 months of silence. The neurosurgeon who reviewed it, a compact, deliberate woman named Dr. Simone Achebe, studied the image for 40 seconds without speaking. Then she looked at Teresa. Who flagged the positioning correlation? I did. Achebe nodded once. This is operable. Breck said, the functional prognosis remains poor regardless of decompression. The prognosis is poor because of the compression, Achebe said. Remove it and we don't know what we have. She looked at Breck. That is the point. Breck's voice went smooth in the way voices go, when the argument is already lost and pride is the last thing left to protect. The patient cannot consent. His advance directive requires family authorization for surgical intervention. Felix's right hand moved 1 tap. Achebe looked at it. She moved to the bedside. Sergeant Major Drummond, blink once if you understand me. 1 blink. Blink once if you are aware of your current situation. 1 blink. Do you want surgery discussed? 1 blink. Achebe looked at Breck. Get his wife in here and get ethics. Breck left. What he went to do in the next hour was not just consult ethics. Teresa learned that later. At the time, she stayed with Felix and talked him through the consent process in the quiet voice, relaying questions, reading his taps, translating for Achebe and the ethics officer who arrived looking skeptical and left looking thoughtful. Felix's wife, a woman named Claudette Drummond, arrived with red eyes and a grip on her purse strap that turned her knuckles pale. She looked at Felix on the bed, at the equipment around him, at Teresa beside him. He's been talking to you, she asked. Yes, for about a week. Claudette sat down and took his hand and pressed her forehead against his fingers and cried without sound. Felix's right index finger moved, slowly. Teresa looked away to give them the moment. Breck returned with a document Claudette was asked to review. Teresa glanced at it from across the room and caught the letterhead before anyone thought to move it. Novavale Systems, Cortex Meridian Clinical Trial, Participant Enrollment Consent. She looked at Breck. He looked back with the confidence of a man who believed no one in the room would connect the dots. Teresa connected them. She had been in situations where connecting dots, before the other side noticed, was the difference between mission success and a body bag. She said nothing. She memorized the document header, the date, and the signature line, which was blank. Then she stepped into the hallway and called the patient advocate line. Surgery was scheduled for the following morning. That night, Pauling found her at the nurse's station. He sat down without being asked. Breck tried to get you suspended, he said. Administration said they needed documented grounds. He's filing insubordination. I know. Are you scared? Teresa considered the question. I'm focused, there's a difference. Pauling looked at her. What are you exactly, before here? She looked at her hands on the keyboard, Air Force Medical. You said that before, but that's not all of it. She did not answer, he did not push. The surgery lasted 4 hours and 11 minutes. Achebe worked precisely and without drama. Teresa stood near the head of the table where she could see the monitors, Felix's face, and the field where the damage was being addressed. She had stood in positions like this before, in aircraft, in forward stations, once on a hillside in the dark, where the work was the only thing that mattered and everything else had to be set down temporarily and picked up again later, if there was a later. 40 minutes in, the bleeding changed. Pressure dropping, the anesthesiologist said. Achibi's hands did not stop. I see it. Teresa scanned the room the way she had been trained to scan everything, not just what was expected. Temperature too low. Fluids not ahead of the blood loss. She spoke before she could decide whether it was her place to. He needs warming, fluids up. You'll want calcium ready if this continues. Achibi glanced up. Do it. Blood pressure 74, then 79, then 84. Responding, the anesthesiologist said. Teresa turned back to Felix's face beneath the tape and the drape. She spoke low enough that only she could hear. You held an observation post for 14 hours with no resupply and a cracked rib. You are not going to disappear on a table with 6 people trying to keep you here. She paused. Jess told me you were the most stubborn man in the battalion. Prove him right. The monitor steadied. Achieve found the collection 45 minutes later. Small and dark, pressing on the cord in the precise spot that turned everything quiet. She removed it. The cord pulsed. Achibi said, almost to herself, there's preserved tissue. When it was over, she pulled off her gloves and looked at Teresa across the room. He has a chance. How much of one? Enough to find out, she paused. You were military. Teresa kept her voice level. Air Force medical technician. Achibi held her gaze for a moment. Right. Outside the OR, the hospital had been busy in ways Teresa had not been there to see. The patient advocate had escalated to administration. Administration had pulled Breck's file. Someone in records had noticed that the Cortex Meridian enrollment form, the one with Claudette Drummond's signature line blank, bore a date 3 weeks earlier. A date when Felix Drummond had no documented voluntary motor function. Pre-signed consent for a trial that required a patient to be permanently non-recovering. A patient who had been communicating with his nurse for 11 days. The VA police were quiet about it. They usually were, until they weren't. Teresa was outside the ICU when Captain Yvonne Lark found her. Lark was Army, late 40s, short silver hair, and the posture of someone who had spent years deciding things under pressure. She wore civilian clothes and a visitor badge but carried herself like a uniform. Nurse Vang, she said. Teresa looked at her. Captain Yvonne Lark, Army Special Operations Medical Liaison. I was notified of the surgery by Drummond's unit. She paused. I understand you've been communicating with him. Yes. Via a TAP code. A field adaptation. His unit used it in austere environments, short-range communication when radio silence was required. How do you know it? Teresa said nothing. Lark studied her. Sergeant Major Drummond served with the 75th Ranger Regiment. His medical support during the Kandahar rotation was provided by Air Force personnel attached under a joint command structure. The attachment was classified. She watched Teresa's face. There's a name in the after-action report from that rotation. A call sign. Sable. Para-rescue jumper, detached from the 38th Rescue Squadron. Medical operator, hoist qualified, awarded the Air Medal with Valor after an extraction under fire in Helmand Province. Lark paused. She disappeared from the service record 2 years after that rotation, employment gap. Then she showed up at a VA hospital in Kansas. Teresa kept her hands still. They wanted to shake. She was not going to let them. He knew you, Lark said. It was not a question. Yes. He was trying to reach you. Yes. Lark was quiet for a moment. Then, Jess Hahn's mother has been trying to find out for 6 years whether her son was alone when he died. No one could tell her because the operation was classified and the people who were there were either dead or not talking. She held Teresa's gaze. Felix Drummond was talking. You just had to learn to listen. Teresa pressed the back of her wrist against her eyes for exactly 1 second. Then she put her arm down. I need to be in there when he wakes, she said. I know, Lark said. Go. Felix came back in pieces, the way people come back from anesthesia. First awareness, then focus, then something that looked like recognition. Teresa was beside the bed. Claudette was on the other side with her hand over his. Teresa pressed 2 fingers to his palm. He tapped once. Still here. She answered, received. Claudette watched them without speaking. Her eyes were full. Teresa leaned close. Surgery is done, the pressure is off, Achibi said preserved tissue. She said possible. She paused. Possible is enough. His lips moved. No sound came, but they moved. She put her ear close. The breath that came out was not quite a word, more like the shape of one, pressed through a throat remembering how to work. Sable. The monitors did not change. The fluorescent lights did not change. The room looked exactly as it had 30 seconds before. But Teresa Vang closed her eyes and for 1 moment let herself be found. When she opened them, she looked at Claudette. He said my call sign, the name he knew me by. Claudette nodded slowly. He would say it sometimes. Before, when he was asleep, I never knew what it meant. It meant someone who found him once, Teresa said, and came back. Breck's arrest was not dramatic. It rarely was when the paperwork was thorough. VA police walked him out through the administrative entrance at 6:15 the following morning. 3 forged consent documents, falsified progress notes, enrollment fees from Novavale Systems deposited to a consulting LLC that existed only on paper. He had needed Felix Drummond classified as permanently, completely non-recovering. A decorated Ranger Sergeant Major enrolled in a private neurotech trial was a headline worth a great deal of money. A Ranger Sergeant Major who was communicating with his nurse was worth nothing. The hospital opened a review covering every case Breck had managed in the preceding 4 years. Felix spoke his wife's name 9 days after surgery. One word, shredded at the edges, barely there. Claudette heard it from across the room and did not move for a long moment. Then she crossed to him and pressed her forehead against his and stayed there. Teresa stood in the doorway and did not go in. 2 weeks after that, Felix tapped a message into her palm. Slowly, in the old code, the field adaptation that existed nowhere in any official record. JHSAID. She waited. NOTYOURFT. Her throat closed. She did not cry in the room. She cried in the supply closet 3 minutes later, sitting on a stool with her back against the shelves, and she did not apologize to herself for any of it. Jesse Hahn's mother received a letter 2 months later. It was written carefully and said only what could be said, and what could be said was enough. That he was not alone, that someone was with him, that the last message he gave to someone who would carry it exactly as far as it needed to go. Lark came to Teresa's unit on a Friday afternoon in January and placed a small envelope on the medication cart beside her. His commanding officer wanted you to have this, Lark said. It was in Drummond's kit when they shipped his gear stateside. Teresa opened it. Inside was a faded patch, 38th Rescue Squadron, her old unit. On the back, in Jesse Hahn's handwriting, she recognized it immediately. The same handwriting that had written IOU, 1 cup of hot coffee on a field ration wrapper outside Kandahar, were 4 words. Sable, stop, we're good. Teresa held the patch against her palm and stood there for a while. Then she pinned it inside her locker, above the photograph Captain Lark had brought her. Felix and Jesse and Teresa on a dusty airstrip, squinting against the sun, alive and not yet knowing what was coming. She went back to work. Felix Drummond walked 3 steps without support on the 61st day after surgery. 3 steps. He stood with both hands on the parallel bars and lifted 1 foot, then the other, then the first one again. And when he stopped, he was shaking, and Claudette was crying, and the rehab therapist stood very still with her clipboard pressed against her chest. Teresa was at the end of the bars. She said nothing. Felix looked at her. He said Sable, clearer this time, almost himself. She said, Ridgeback. And that was enough. The Eisenhower VA instituted a new review protocol for all TBI patients classified as minimally conscious or below. Every patient received an augmentative communication assessment within 14 days of admission. The protocol was named for no one officially, but the staff called it the Drummond Standard, and everyone who worked the ward knew who had fought for it. Teresa Vang did not accept the formal commendation. She accepted a transfer to the neurology unit as clinical lead for communication-dependent care, a title that had not existed before her, and that no one had thought to create until she demonstrated what happened when it was missing. She wore the same bright blue scrubs. She still checked doorways before entering. She still moved quietly through rooms where other people made noise, and she still had the habit of watching hands. The small movements of fingers that most people dismissed, and that sometimes turned out to be everything. She did not stop being careful. She stopped pretending the care did not have a name. The first morning in her new role, she found a whiteboard on her desk. Someone had written on it in Pauling's handwriting. Still here. She turned it to face the room.